Trepang 2 is a first-person shooter that takes no prisoners. It's fast, aggressive, and designed to keep players on their toes as groups of soldiers hunt you down and put the pressure on you, forcing you to rely on your wits as you wipe them out one by one. You're cloaking, diving, sliding, punching, and slow-mo blasting your way through each set piece as you work to bring down the Horizon Corporation. I'm Thompson, this is AI in Games, and strap in for one of the biggest deep dives into a game that we've ever had access to. I sat down with two of the developers behind Trepang 2 to find out how it all came together, the games that inspired it, the journey from tech demo to fully fledged game, and how a team of just 4 developers built a fully fledged first-person shooter that not only pays homage to classic titles of the early 2000s, but carves out its own direction in the process. In an era of indie studios recapturing the vibe and feel of classic first-person shooters, Trepang 2 strikes a balance between the over-the-top action and the need for survival of early 2000s titles, with the player utilizing increased mobility and superhuman powers to face off against waves of ruthless Spec Ops forces across a number of primary and secondary campaign missions. Described by popular first-person shooter content creator G-Man Lives as the Fear sequel we never got in his playthrough of the demo back in 2019, the close quarters combat in tight industrial settings, combined with the use of slow-mo, is evident that the game is something of an homage to Monolith's classic shooter, but it's equally a lot more than that. You're sliding around, you're sneaking up using a cloak, enemies can become meat shields, you can prime the grenades on their belt and throw them into the crowd, you can dual wield specific weapons, it even has a handful of boss battles. It's pulling from many different corners of the genre and then repackaging it into an experience that feels distinctly fresh, anarchic, and above all, fun. But what makes this stand out in a number of ways isn't just how the enemy AI has to be designed to handle all of the weird and wonderful ways players can interact with them, but that the game itself was built by a core team of only 4 people. And so in the weeks after launch of the Blade Kisser DLC in the fall of 2024, I sat down for a lengthy conversation with Chung, the programmer and designer of the game, and Andersson, who is a technical artist and animator. Not only did we get into a real deep dive on everything they had built, but the team shared a collection of behind-the-scenes assets and documentation that we'll cover in this video. In all seriousness, this might be the most access to the making of a game we've ever had on the channel. But before we get into the meat of it all, there was one burning question sitting at the front of my mind. What's with the name? And did I somehow miss Trepang 1 hitting Steam at some point in the last couple of years? The answer is simple, but also complicated.
I guess, do you want the long answer or the short answer?
I'll happily take the long answer.
If we go all the way back to 2011, I was a university student doing a game jam, and the game jam's theme was loneliness, and we had to make a game within 48 hours, and we knew we couldn't make any kind of like sophisticated like physics or anything like that, so we made the game underwater, and then we're thinking like, what's a sea creature that's like really lonely? And then we're like, oh, like a sea cucumber, like I think they look pretty lonely, right? So we were looking at like how do they attack other creatures, and it turns out they can't, but they can defend themselves by ejecting some of their organs, and then their predators eat those organs instead of them, and then they can regrow their organs. And then we didn't know what to name this game jam game, so we went on Google and we looked up like exotic names for sea cucumber, and then I think it was either Indonesian or Malaysian. The term for sea cucumber was Trepang, so that was Trepang 1, and then starting Trepang 2, it was just me in the beginning, and I didn't have any ideas for the name of the game, so I was like, all right, let's name it Trepang 2. And I guess we stuck with it because this game also involves, ejecting organs everywhere, and so it's kind of similar that way. I mean, there's no sea cucumbers, but like thematically it's similar in that organs get ejected.
Because I sort of read like, okay, it's Indonesian for sea cucumber, all right, and then the thing that blew my mind was then I think the next time I looked it up, or the next time I played it, I'm like, hang on, this got published by Team 17. You got that past marketing and PR as well.
They tried.
Oh yeah, so that was actually really hard. They sent us like a whole spreadsheet of suggestions. But I think the funny thing is, I think what came through in the end was we showed them, like, if you type in Trepang, nothing shows up other than our game. Like, there's no better SEO because nobody would name a game Sea Cucumber.
Can't argue with that logic. Like, definitely the SEO on this is top notch. Like, you put Trepang into Google and it's just 90% of it is this game, and then also like, oh yeah, sea cucumbers. So like, while the game was published by Team 17 in the summer of 2023, it had slowly developed a following on the internet, courtesy of demos being shared on IndieDB as far back as 2017, with only Chung working on the project at that time. As the prototype continued to score praise for its intense gunplay and fun spin on classic shooting mechanics, the team began to flesh out, with Andersson coming on board alongside Brandon Tran and Brandon McKagan, each of whom taking on tasks across multiple disciplines for the project. But while the team quadrupled in size, and half of the studio now being called Brandon, it continued to retain its scrappy indie game jamming sensibilities. As word of mouth grew, with the game repeatedly appearing in the top 100 games voted on IndieDB from 2017 to 2019, the team were adding more and more features, finding the fun and the chaos with every new addition. Did the game always start with all these mechanics in it, or did you start with one thing and then just like, oh, you know what this game's missing is a really kick-ass slide, or this is missing a cloak? Like, was it always kind of envisioned as all these different mechanics in it together, or did it slowly, every time you added something new, it was like, oh god, here's a new problem we hadn't, factored in?
We didn't do this the proper way, so we didn't have a design document or anything like that. We would just get together and then dream up crazy ideas, and then a few days later someone would be like, oh hey, I added this thing by the way, and we're just like, what did you do? Of course, every time it was like, this is so much fun, we can't throw this away. But yeah, every tiny thing that we added, like the sliding, the cloaking, the hostage taking, everything, just it added like a whole bunch of technical headaches that we were fortunately able to solve at the end. I guess since we all come from like really technical backgrounds, we never really saw it as like, oh man, this is like just a huge pain in the ass. Like, it was always like a technical challenge that we wanted to solve, because that's fun for us.
But like in terms of abilities and stuff like, sorry to cut you off, but like it did grow like from like way back when Wilson had like a prototype for Trepang's sort of general idea and everything like that. That hasn't changed that much since then from when we released. We just kind of like elaborated a little bit here and there on that and built out generally like the systems that ended up in the game around that. It was like, it was already kind of there from the beginning. But in terms of like abilities and everything like this,
like one of the things I did kind of take away from it was like how much of the game is kind of vibes based, where like I could actually see, like, as you're playing it, on the development side, you're like, oh, you know what would make this really kick ass? Like, I was playing it a couple of days ago in preparation, because I haven't actually finished the game, but I was going back replaying a bunch of the missions I'd played before, and my brothers are visiting, and my brother came in, he's like, what on earth is this? And I'm like, this is Trepang 2, I'm interviewing these guys, but like in a good way. He's like, this is wild. And I think, what was it, I cloaked, ran up, punched a guy, grabbed him, held him as hostage, and pulled a shotgun out, and then shot a guy in the head, and then pumped it single-handed. And he's like, that's the coolest fucking thing I've ever seen. Just the sequence of actions coming in, and it was, I think, like that vibes-based aspect of it, of just, oh, I can grab a guy, oh, I can shoot a guy, and then I love games that also, like, as you might have noticed, I'm a big Terminator mark, so anybody who's doing cool reload animations with shotguns immediately gets, like, my approval. So as soon as it was, like, pumping it, catches it, shoots it, I was like, ah.
I mean, so half of that was already there from when I came on in early 2019. When I saw the prototype myself before I even joined the project, that's basically how I reacted when I saw the prototype at the time. And I was like, I gotta jump on this ship and like help him out to reach this vision. We have to make this work, because I want to see this alive and well as well. So what you mentioned there about the one-handed shotgun pumping and stuff like that, that's basically where when I came in and I started to build out the more visual aspects of like, how do we fully like properly visualize all of these different mechanics and elements. That's like what came afterwards. But at its core, it's very much the same as it was since pretty early on in the prototyping stages.
Now it's worth taking a minute just to go over the AI architecture of the game. While the hype surrounding Trepang 2 often harks back to fear, the AI tech stack has very little in common. As we know from our various videos on the subject here on AI in Games, fear relies on goal-oriented action planning, a hybrid of forward search planning algorithms with action execution handled using a finite state machine. Be sure to catch the original video, the AI 101 episode, or our feature-length retrospective with Fear's AI programmer Jeff Orkin to find out more. But Trepang 2 relies on the core AI technologies available right out of the box. Developed in Unreal Engine 4, the core of Trepang 2's AI is behavior trees. Again, a topic we've covered at great length on the channel over the years, with my AI 101 video a good starting point if you're not familiar. The sub-behaviors of the tree are organized by priority, with lower priority actions on the right and higher priority on the left, with the system designed to override behaviors when necessary. Hence, an enemy will investigate gunfire or disturbances until they're shot at, with combat overriding these more passive and exploratory behaviors. This is actually rather similar to the enemies in Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 that we covered back in episode 77, where Saber Interactive built a modified behavior tree architecture that allowed for this reactive behavior to occur for dozens of NPCs at once in highly intense combat scenarios. But another area of the architecture that strikes me as interesting is that the game generates its own level markup dynamically during play. If you're not familiar with the concept, when you have enemies needing to use cover or finding interesting points to interact with or attack from, they typically seek out an appropriate point in the game that has been tagged in the level itself for them to go towards. In our Artifacts episode on Marvel's Spider-Man, I explained that all of the web swinging and point launching is achieved using markup auto-generated using a tool pipeline. Meanwhile, in our episode on BioShock Infinite, I discussed how Elizabeth's behavior is reliant on the markup not just showing what objects can be interacted with, but they tell her what animations to play. Plus, in the Fear retrospective, Jeff talked about the team having to go through huge passes on each level to ensure the NPCs could see cover points and interactables. As Chung explained, Trepang 2's markup is generated dynamically through use of Unreal's Environmental Query System, or EQS. Given the pace of the game is so fast, the markup has to be highly contextual. Unlike a lot of other shooters where the player enters through one area and the NPCs take cover up ahead, in Trepang 2, you can often enter a combat arena from various angles, be it through a secondary doorway, or you simply cloak up, run behind everyone and then open fire. The highest priority for all of the NPCs is their own self-preservation, so there needs to be a dynamic system to generate the markup such that the NPCs always know good points to move towards.
What we did that was different than most games out there is that most games rely on a lot of hand-placed markups, or even like a lot of triggers and scripts. So like a level designer has to put if the player enters this room, this guy takes cover behind this couch. But for us, everything was so open-ended because we had rooms with 6 different entrances, or maybe even there's a second floor and there's a staircase, and there's all these different ways of entering a room, and the player moves super fast. He moves 3 times as fast as a regular bad guy, and they can also go invisible and slow down time. So basically the player could end up anywhere and the enemies might not even be aware of it. So we couldn't really rely on just a lot of hand-placed markup, because that'd be really time consuming. We'd have to take into account all the contingencies. For example, what if a player went invisible, walked into a room, and then uncloaked at the other side of the room and started shooting at people? They would need to reorganize themselves and get into cover. So we had to just do all this stuff at runtime, because there was just no way to pre-compute this or hand place it.
Perhaps what is the most interesting AI element of the game for me personally is what happens when the player is being hunted. Given the non-linear and often cyclic nature of the level design, it's common for the player to enter an open area in one direction, take out an enemy, and then run away and break line of sight with the squad of NPCs. Given this is such a core requirement of the game loop, it's critical that when the player breaks line of sight that the NPCs try to chase you down, but it needs to feel reactive, and to an extent, realistic. Not only because you could be standing watching them with your cloak active, but also given it feels like the enemies are reacting to your behaviour and you can capitalise on it. But if they're too smart, it'll feel like the game is cheating you.
Like, how do you keep track of the player without, like, do the NPCs ever cheat, or did you actively avoid doing that?
One thing we didn't really think of when we first started the game, and I think, you know, most game developers never think about this, is, so what happens when an enemy loses sight of the player? So in most games, this isn't really an issue because if I can see them, they can see me. It's just, you know, once an enemy sees you, they continue to track you. Even if you know, somehow sneak all the way behind them, they'll just turn around and shoot at you. But we knew we couldn't fake that because, like, you know, people could go invisible anytime. They can zip around to the other side of the map, and, you know, it would feel unfair if they just suddenly, you know, 180 no-scoped you as you snuck up on them. We looked at a whole bunch of different solutions where, like, you know, where should they be looking at when the player disappears? Because at that moment, like, it's really quiet. Like, when you cloaked, like, you're obviously not shooting and you're just running around, so you can clearly see what the enemies are doing. And if they're frozen, or they're staring at the wall, or if they're, like, you know, kind of sidekick and somehow can see you, all those totally break the immersion. So we came up with a system called the Overwatch target system.
The Overwatch system is sort of the inverse of the markup system, in that rather than finding a generated point in the level to break the player's line of sight with the NPC, instead the NPCs are now finding a point in the game space to target after you lose line of sight with them. When the player breaks line of sight with an NPC or makes a loud enough sound stimulus without being spotted, it generates an LKP, or last known position marker, in the game world. From this, the Overwatch system generates a target location, which is found by calculating a navigation path from the NPC to the LKP and running a line of sight check, with the farthest point on the line becoming the target. Given the current orientation of a character and the level geometry, there's no guarantee that the NPC can see the LKP at this time, hence they look at the Overwatch target instead. The NPCs will then move towards the Overwatch target, and often lay down suppressing fire and even throw grenades, to give the impression they're thinking the player is just hiding around the corner. Meanwhile, the Overwatch continues to update to the most farthest point on the navigation path to the LKP that the NPC has line of sight on. Once the LKP can actually be seen, and the player isn't found, then the system runs a new EQS query to guess where it thinks the player has ran off to, and it will generate a new Overwatch target. This whole process essentially repeats itself until the player generates a new sound or visual stimulus for the NPCs to react to. But once the player is back in the fight, there's an opportunity for flanking maneuvers and other team behaviors, ensuring that while your current target might be fleeing for their life, everyone else is working to put the pressure on you.
When you're moving around and they're flanking, how does that work? Are they all, whenever they flank, do they just wait until there's another viable time to flank, or do they just try and flank as soon as they know you're not looking at them?
Going back to the behavior tree, the self-preservation is always placed at the highest priority in the behavior tree. The NPCs have a variable called suppression. Suppression goes higher when dangerous things happen. Basically, like an enemy is looking at me, or they're shooting at me, or they're throwing grenades at me, etc. The result of this is basically, like, if the player is zeroing in on a guy and just bullying one NPC, he's obviously not going to run out and you know, shoot in the face. He's going to focus on hiding. This is just a simple way to manage, like, you know, who should attack and who shouldn't. And it's basically just like, if they're in danger, don't attack, and then they'll just, you know, try to run away, so it looks like they don't want to die, and then everybody else is going to try to flank or find some way to sneak up and yeah, ruin your day.
Does it have then a squad management layer? Because, like, some of them, because like you said, there's bigger encounters, and sometimes they clearly come together in units, like squads of units. Like, is that something that's actually modeled internally in the code base, or is it just like purely like an aesthetic thing, like a presentation thing when they appear in the map?
In every encounter, we group all the NPCs of each faction into a squad of their own. So all the task force guys have one squad in an encounter. Horizon guys have their own squad. The cultists have their own squad, or the monsters have their own squad. And they share sensory information and memory. So if a guy sees you, then everybody in his squad will eventually, notice you too. But actually, we added a delay, so it's like if a guy sees you, he has to finish his dialogue before the sensory info gets passed to his teammates. So if you happen to snap his neck before he finishes his sentence, you can actually get away with that. And then on top of that, it does split the squad into a cover team and an attacking team. It basically cancels out part of the behavior tree. So the cover team will just try to shoot and do suppressive fire and grenades at the player, but try to keep their distance so they won't like rush or flank. But the attacking team will try to aggressively flank and get close to you. And then this constantly gets reorganized. So the people who are in danger, their suppression value is high, they get put into the cover team, so they're not trying to rush into danger. So this ensures basically half of the NPCs you're fighting, they're going to be trying to find some way to flank you, while the other half are trying to distract you or keep you pinned down. But other than that, we don't actually do a lot of squad behavior. Like most of the AI is just on the individual level.
Do you ever like balance the shooting or anything like that?
We never do anything like that because I think when we escalate things, like we really want the player to feel it. And we basically put like a hard cap at like 21. We're not going to have more than 21 guys. I think there might be like 1 or 2 arenas where we had like 23 or 24 or something like that. But we knew like at some point it's just going to get insane. And we didn't want them to do the kung fu behavior where like, half of them sit around and then the other half attack you or something like that. If there's an NPC and they're trying to fight you, they're putting 100% of their effort into it. They don't slack off at all.
After running through several hours of Trepang 2 in preparation for our interview, the thing I really took away from the game is how readable it is. The game does a great job of making the world legible to the player, even in the thick of combat. Animations help communicate what enemies are trying to do, and the audio barks and other Foley effects help express to the player what is happening in ways that you only appreciate once you stop to think about it. This was, as I discovered, a huge amount of work on Jacob's side of the production.
We tried to properly represent visually what the AIs were doing and thinking at any time. There's a lot of information that the player should be able to derive from not just looking at the battlefield but also hearing everything that's going on. But so for the visual aspects and animation side, there was a lot of effort put into actually properly showing what the AI, the brain itself was doing at any time. So for example, knowing where the enemies were looking or like focusing, we have like a dual layer system that separately turns the torso and the head. So we can have a guy facing a direction, then starting to spot you at the corner of his eye. So then he actually turns his head first to signify very, very quickly that he's actually noticing you and he's like about to engage you basically. But then as he's doing that, his body is coming to turn to be able to shoot you. So since we have slow motion as an ability in the game, any piece of visual information gets broken down in a very digestible manner. So whatever we can properly communicate to the player visually is fantastic in a state like that. So animations that are critical to, like show the player basically when you're about to get shot or when it's relatively safe to be around this guy or something like that, like someone firing a shotgun and then going for the pump. In slow-mo, all of this information is like digestible, so it's essential when you're engaging people, like which guy am I aiming right now, which one is safe to engage while he's doing that thing. Like you can make split-second decision-making in a scenario like that. So we try to really not just make it look cool in slow motion, which is very important as well, but properly communicating the mechanics and what the brains are doing that we can't see at any time. But that was very difficult.
I mean, you've got the technical side of that, so building up those animations, but then critically, as something that Wilson said in the email, like you were doing a lot of motion capture
for this project on an indie budget during the pandemic as well. So, let's get into that. That sounds stressful.
There wasn't a lot of motion capture done, to be honest. A lot of it was pre-packaged animations that then got repurposed. So I spent a lot of time manually hand keying a lot of animation assets for the game. But then at the tail end, we started working with a external motion capture studio over in Vancouver, where they actually helped us to make some cutscenes and fill in some of the holes that we had in terms of properly polishing up these NPC mechanics, like them getting up, for example, from being knocked down. It's a pretty complicated animation to do, and we wanted to have variations for it. So we had, I think, about a dozen made. There's quite a few that we have in the game. But so doing that by hand would be way too much work for me to do single-handedly at the time. It was mainly just the guys in the studio wearing masks during recording sessions, and I was just sitting in a Discord call with them, trying to direct them over my phone that they had put up in the studio. It's a pretty interesting little setup we had there, actually. But yeah, it was a lot of fun working with those guys. You should have seen some of the guys. They were putting in some awesome performances. So that was great.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so before we had all these transition animations, like the enemies or the NPCs could move just like bots. So like they could turn around or crouch or uncrouch or they could do anything on a dime, and it kind of felt like you were a super soldier, but they were also super soldiers, because like they would 180 scope you, or like crouch and then change direction and then sprint off in the distance or something. So I think a lot of the transition animations, like it sounds like that doesn't really add a lot, but it actually made them feel a lot more like grounded as humans, because it takes them time to like uncrouch and then run away from a grenade or turn around to shoot you and that kind of thing. It added to the power fantasy.
But it also came with its own set of sort of limitations or difficulties when it came to the mechanics of the NPC. So instead of, before we had sort of built the game or the combat mechanics around them being able to do that. So, well, I mean, to a degree at least, but now that they were performing these sort of things like turning and things that technically took more time than just straight interpolating, or not even interpolating their motions, it made them pretty easy to deal with, you could say, in the early stages of adding those types of things. So we spent a lot of time sort of polishing and adding layers to it. So in the beginning they couldn't turn and shoot at the same time, for example, which was detrimental to keep them sort of competitive. So if they're doing a simple turn, they could shoot later on, and if they're doing a full-on 180 flip turn, that's when they like pause for just a split second, but they're very quickly back to shooting again. But that was another one of those things where we had to spend time tightening things up just to ensure that they still felt good to play against as competent NPCs.
I think like the one thing to add on the top of that is also like the voice work you've got as well. So they have all the additional barks. Like I remember chatting with Jeff Orkin about this on Fear, and just like it'll be a different scenario, of course, because he was working in a studio with a whole bunch of people, and like I think the sound guy just kicked his door in one day and said, "We're recording voices. I need voice prompts." And he was just like, "Shit," and literally opened up like a Word document and wrote like 50 lines of dialogue or whatever. Like, what was that process like? Because again, you've also got the audio layer on top of it, and like the combination of them sounding like they're trying to react to you in a tactical way, but also like I just love when they're always just panicking. Like that's some of the best. It's oh shit! Like it's like that's the good stuff,
Yeah, so I mean, credits go to VA Brandon Tran on our team. He directed all the voice actors and wrote most of their lines, but I did work with him pretty closely on it. And I think one thing he had a lot of fun with once I gave him the power to, because he's a creative guy. He likes to abuse the power that I gave him was so I basically, originally it was just barks, but then I was like, well, what if we could make a system where we could grab nearby NPCs and then make a series of dialogue between them. So originally it was just started out with like an NPC saying, "I'm moving out," and then he would move. But then we added a system where, like, you know, we could grab a nearby guy who's laying down covering fire and make him say, like, I'm covering, go move out, and then the guy moves out. Or sorry, I'm covering, you go move out, and he says, yes, okay, I'll move out, and then guy moves out. Or vice versa, where he's like, I'm going to move out, cover me, and then the other guy says, yes, I'm covering. And then I think at some point we went a little bit too far with this. Like, we had everything turning into like a 3 or 4 line conversation, and then I was like, all right, Brandon, can you like tone this down a bit? We don't need like you know, this Shakespearean play playing out as each guy, you know, reloads his gun or whatever. But we did record like
dead halfway through the narration, you know.
Exactly, that's what was always happening. Like, they would be like, oh, should I do this? And he's like, yes, you should. And he's like, okay, I'm doing it. And then, you know, they would never be able to finish their conversation. They get killed every time. So I mean, we did have fun experimenting with that, but we did end up having to shorten it a bit because, yeah, like the game is just too fast. But I think another really important thing with VO is just like when the player is doing all this stuff, they're not really aware. They're like, you know, they're running around or like punching walls and stuff. So we had to have lines, like there are varying degrees of suspicion for the enemies when they hear something or see something. So like, yeah, Brandon wrote like, I think probably hundreds of lines for these where it's just like, I think I heard something, or it's like, I probably heard something, and it's like, I definitely heard something, or it's like, you know, that's the 10th time I've heard something I'm very angry at. Because we had to make sure like players would understand that like if they're running around and the enemies are angry, that something actually happened, that they didn't just like see you through the wall kind of thing. So VO helped like a lot with this kind of stuff.
Of course, it's all well and good us sitting here and celebrating how great everything turned out in the end. So, like any interview, I asked Wilson and Jacob about all the hiccups, the happy accidents, the funny bugs, and the bits they smoothed over just to make sure the game got over the line. And like any game that is successfully shipped, which is of course a miracle in itself, there's a bunch of fun stories to wrap things up for us.
So I think one thing is originally, like, there was one time where I found all these like military field manuals on the internet, and I was like, oh man, what if I like implement all these like realistic infantry tactics? But yeah, it goes back to the Mike Tyson thing where like everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face kind of thing. So it just ended up being these really cumbersome you know, behaviors that would never actually get to execute, and it was just more fun making the AI react rather than doing these really elaborate schemes. And then, yeah, another funny bug that, I guess, yeah, a funny bug that we shipped with was we accidentally made the enemies interpolate their aim while they're aiming towards you, but that interpolation never actually reached its target. So that actually created a paradox where enemies could never actually hit you while you're moving perpendicular to them. But that just makes it more fun, so we just shipped it with that bug anyway. But yeah, okay, Jacob, onto your things.
It's kind of Doom-esque, I think, that mechanic. That mechanic, it's not a bug.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
It's a feature.
Exactly.
It's like anime running, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
You're just invincible as long as you've got those arms out doing the fly pose.
That's it.
I mean, it's just a fun fact, I guess, that in the late mission Horizon HQ, where you're assaulting the bad guys HQ, there's a boss fight at the end where you're fighting a helicopter. That was actually supposed to be scrapped. We felt that it just didn't hit the right sort of design philosophies, and it just didn't feel good to play. But as we had scrapped it and already come up with like a good sort of fitting solution internally, we had a discussion with our publisher, and we sort of reintroduced it after the fact that we had already found a solution. So we sort of went back to the drawing board and just kind of like, what should we do with this? Like, how can we make this work? So we ended up merging the different mechanics of putting the helicopter back in the fight, but we put one of these. We have brains that pop out of the ground that are uploading the CEO's Anton Lazar's brain to the cloud. And I just took one of those and I slapped it on the helicopter, and I made him bob and weave like crazy, and thanks to the brain now being on the helicopter, we constantly had a UI element pointing towards it, so we never lost it, and we could run around the arena and do other things as we were fighting it at the same time, and it felt pretty intense, like compared to what was there before. So that was like one of those cases where this like pretty awkward situation in production actually turned into something that was pretty cool in the end. So I'm actually very happy with how that came out, even though it is kind of a little bit different from what's happening in the game normally.
Oh, I just wanted to add, I mean, speaking of, I guess, awkward fixes, is so we have this boss called the Flesh Golem, and he's a really big guy, and he can only melee attack, or he can do a grab, but he's mostly a melee enemy. But the arena we had him in was really cramped, and we were struggling because he wouldn't fit through these doors, and we were having all these issues with navigation. So one thing we decided to do is we just made the entire arena destructible. And so when the golem spawns, we set all the arena geometry to not affect nav mesh. So the golem just tries to walk through it, and we just made it so when he touches any of these the wooden panels that make up most of the level, they just explode.
Which looks awesome, by the way. He's just like running like the Hulk through the level and just crashing everything. It's awesome. And he also grabs you through the level as well. Like he's got a tentacle attack to mitigate the player's movement abilities, because the player can just jump up and balance on like a thin thing that he can't reach. So we added an ability to him where he got a little tentacle thing that comes out of his hand, and then he launches it towards the player, and that doesn't even care about the level geometry that's in front of it either. So it just goes through like a bunch of walls, grabs the player and pulls him towards him. So that was a fun little thing as well, to like mitigate or fight the player's abilities head on like that.
Yeah, nice. So just exploding walls. Exploding walls solve so many things. Like, I think we did that even in a game I was working on. So how do we solve this? Just blow the wall up. And just,
I mean, that's how we solve a lot of issues actually during production. Just these like funky edge case solutions that we just fit in there last minute, and it just vastly improves the situation. So yeah, that's game development.
Trepang 2 delivers on its premise of being an explosive and chaotic shooter that harkens back to an era that many of us remember fondly, which I think is also emblematic of this channel. I don't think there's that many of you who watch this series who are, born since then. Oh god, existential crisis incoming. The game was a 6-year journey that started out with one person and a fun idea, but like anything, it requires a lot of smart ideation and a lot of creativity to work through the many challenges faced. After launch in 2023, the Blade Kisser expansion launched in the summer of 2024, adding new missions and new weapons to great acclaim from players. I have a sneaking suspicion this isn't the last we've seen of Trepang Studios. Thanks for watching this episode of AI in Games, and a huge thank you to Wilson and Jacob, not just for taking the time to sit down with me and discuss Trepang 2, but for all of the additional resources they provided that you've seen throughout this video. They went out of their way to record the in-engine footage for us to use in this episode, and it really helps bring the whole thing to life. So once again, a huge thank you to the team, and be sure to go and check out the game itself, with Trepang 2 available now on Steam, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series S and X. I don't know about you, but I'm floored. Trying to record all that gameplay footage where it looks like I know what I'm doing, that's pretty exhausting. You know how hard it is to look semi-competent at a video game at my age? This is why AI in Games is funded by its viewers. So head over to AIinGames.com to support the show and help me continue to do what I do. And as a special bonus to all of our crowdfunding supporters, you can watch the full interview with Jacob and Wilson over on AIinGames.com. Alright, that's enough out of me. I'm out of here. Stay safe. Take care. I'll be back.